Welcome. It is my great privilege to be able to welcome you. I am Sarah Islin. I'm the President and CEO of the Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts. We are delighted to be able to share this space. This is what we call our Innovation Center. It's where we free ourselves up from thinking thoughts bound by traditional feeling conference rooms. And it's a space that we really love to be able to share with folks from the community. And so it is our great privilege to get to share this space today with our colleagues from the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, from MA Taxpayers Foundation, and to have them walk through with us the findings from the latest competitiveness research, which I've had a chance to kind of dig into and found fascinating. And this is incredibly important information for all of us. It feels like, whether you work in healthcare, or we're going to be joined by Marty Meehan, the president of the University of Massachusetts, for a panel discussion, this does feel like an inflection point. And not just in education, not just in healthcare, although I know we'll talk a lot about that today, but for the broader business community. And there is nowhere that I would rather be when we're confronted with challenging situations or moments in time in this community, to be in Massachusetts, where we have such a long and proud history of meeting the moment, of working with data, and of having the kinds of conversations that we need to be having around how do we take challenges and turn them into opportunities. So just thrilled to be joined by all of you and to be able to partner with MA Taxpayers, with the Chamber, with UMass, and all the rest of you. And so with that, I think I'm going to turn this over now to Doug Howgate, the President and CEO of MA Taxpayers Foundation, and then we're going to turn it over to Steve from MASIC to talk about the polling results. So, very good. Thank you.
So I want to start by thanking Sarah, Candace, the team at Blue Cross for hosting us, for participating today, for being such great partners, so thank you. We presented last week at the cost trends hearing together, so this is a 2 for 2. I want to thank Jim and the phenomenal team, Danielle, Angelica, Casey, everyone else at the Chamber, for always being so wonderful to work with on these events. This is the second time we've done this. Really appreciate that. And I want to thank President Meehan and his phenomenal team at UMass for participating in the event today. So I am going to talk through very briefly the competitiveness index that we released about a month ago, and then I want to leave time before the panel to give it to Steve Cazella from MASIC Polling Group, because one of the things we wanted to do this year, make sure I'm able to advance slides. You know, you say to yourself that you're never going to be the person who can't figure out how to work a clicker, and then it happens. But I want to give most of the time in the first half to Steve, because one of the things we wanted to do with the index this year is continue to benchmark the competitiveness metrics that we think matter for Massachusetts, but we also want to know what people from Massachusetts think, right? Because so much of this is about the data, but so much of it is also about people's perception of how they feel about living in Massachusetts, working in Massachusetts, starting a business in Massachusetts. So we were thrilled to work with MASIC Polling Group this year on that. So to just give folks a little bit of a brief background, so we can now call it the Annual Competitiveness Index because we've done it twice. And what we wanted to do with this index is to start to create a common language around all of these conversations around competitiveness. We hear this all the time, and a lot of these conversations I think are not particularly constructive because people use it for one specific thing that we're good at or bad at, and what we need to kind of understand is how do we think about competitiveness more broadly, and then how do we measure that over time? And a lot of the work and our engagement in this in MTF goes back to work that Andy Bagley on our team has done. And it really came out of after the pandemic, when I think you saw this increase in discussion of and concern with state competitiveness, our attempt to get before folks the idea that yes, these issues were exacerbated by the pandemic, but a lot of the underlying factors of cost, of the attributes that Massachusetts have that are wonderful, some of the concerning trends that we saw predate the pandemic. And so certainly we need to understand how the pandemic has changed things, but we need to also understand that irrespective of that, Massachusetts had some big labor force challenges that we were going to need to get our arms around no matter what. Now the interesting thing with doing this every year now, and I think the reason why we want to do this is numbers change, right? And one thing we saw in 2024, this is labor force compared to pre-pandemic data, is an uptick in our labor force for the first time in a long time. That is entirely attributable to international immigration, right? And I'll come back to that again in a second, because one of the other themes in this year's index is this idea that as we think about our historic strengths that really are unique, The changing federal landscape, changing federal policies add a new threat to some of those strengths, like international immigration, Massachusetts being a place that the best and brightest from around the country and around the world want to come to. That's under threat now in a way that maybe we didn't foresee a year or two ago. So just a little background on the index. What we want to do is we want to measure our competitiveness in 3 ways. So first of all, geographically, so compared to our New England neighbors, because we have seen more outmigration to other New England states in recent years. Our economic competitors, who are the states that we are most likely to lose jobs to. So that's New York, it's California, it's North Carolina, it's Florida, and it's Texas. And then I think honestly, most importantly, we want to compare ourselves to ourselves. Are we getting better? Are we getting worse? How are those trend lines changing? And we do that across 4 broad categories. So it's basically underlying economic characteristics, demographics, business and employment factors, and then quality of life. And what you'll see here, and obviously we'll share the index with everyone, and I want to just hit upon some highlights here to give enough time for Steve, but resident life, when you think about things like quality of our education system, life expectancy, elements like that, we do quite well compared to our competitors. When you look at business, employment, and investment factors, we do poorly, right? So I think the game plan is clear before us historically in terms of what we need to work on. And when you look at our biggest strengths, it tells a clear story, right? We continue to have the best K-12 education system in the country, though that's obviously not consistent throughout the state. We have the best higher education system, public and private, in the nation. That leads to a very highly educated workforce that then interacts with the economic sectors that we rely upon. That's a great strength to have, but I think it also indicates some of the policy areas we need to focus on. Think of K-12 education. Right now, we're engaged in efforts to determine, should the state have any statewide graduation standard for high school at all? One would think the answer to that would be an easy yes, but you'd be surprised, right? And so I think some of these things, that if we take them for granted and don't continue to do the work to make sure that Massachusetts focuses on K-12 education, we're gonna lose that #1 ranking. And then as I'll talk about in a second, and I'm sure we'll hear about in the panel, our strength in terms of research, higher education, and that positive feedback loop with innovation is under threat like maybe never before. When you think about our weaknesses, the story's pretty consistent here, but again, we start to see some increasing pressures, especially in areas like healthcare costs. When it comes to infant childcare, commute time, housing, health insurance, energy, Massachusetts is at the bottom of the pack nationally in terms of the cost for families and for employers. And that tells over time, right? Especially when the cost of where you want to start a business might differ from state to state. Not surprisingly, 49th in the nation in business formations per capita, or per employee, 50th in the nation in private employment growth, right? Those are really concerning times that relate back to those cost issues. So when we look at what has changed most, one of the challenging things with doing one of these indexes from year to year is a lot of the stuff doesn't change a ton, right? So you hope, and then you look at them and you say, well, I don't want that to change in a bad way. But what do we see this year? We see the impact of international immigration in terms of our labor force size, right? That's a positive development. On the negative side, the biggest change we see, healthcare costs. And I got news for you, our healthcare costs weren't great before. But over the last year, we've gone from 35th in the nation, 36th in the nation, I should say, to 48th in terms of employer healthcare costs, right? So when you think about those additive cost pressures that relate to where you're gonna add your next job, that becomes a bigger and a bigger factor. And so just to close out on healthcare costs, and then I wanna talk higher ed for a second, this just unpacks the idea that not only are healthcare costs for employers growing, over the last few years, using a slightly different data source, they've actually grown by about 20%. Think about what that means in terms of employer decisions, in terms of business formation decisions. And the other thing, because obviously we always wear our public finance hat as well, this is the biggest cost pressure in the state budget, right? Our inability to get our hands around mass health cost growth is not only going to drive down any spending in other areas of the budget, but when we look at impacts on healthcare enrollment that are coming with federal policy changes, our freedom of motion to do something as a state is going to be entirely kind of determined by our ability to control mass health costs. And then the last thing I want to say before introducing Steve is this idea about how the strengths that Massachusetts historically has had are under unique threat now with changing federal policies, right? When you think about what makes that innovation economy tick, it's things like funding for basic research. It's things like the ability of the best and brightest from around the world to come here to study, and it's our support for our higher education institutions. And we've seen policies in each of those areas that make it harder for Massachusetts to do what we do well. NIH, everyone knows this, I'm sure we'll hear from President Meehan later on. You just look at the pace of NIH funding in Massachusetts this year versus prior years, we're at a fraction of the level we've received in other years. And it's easy to forget sometimes just how unique Massachusetts' higher education success system is. Even though we're a relatively small state, we are number 4 in the nation in terms of total number of international students who attend our institutions, number 2 in the nation in terms of postdocs, right? We rely on the fact that smart people want to come here to do their work. And so when policies are put in place that make it harder to do that, it's bad for the United States economy, full stop, but it's particularly bad for Massachusetts. So, in closing, before I give to Steve, I think the underlying elements of our competitiveness picture are similar to what we talked about last year. We have some unique strengths that I don't think we want to give up, related to education, related to innovation, related to smart people being here and building what's next for the economy. Our cost challenges continue to be borne out in the product of where people are starting businesses, where employment is growing, and we're moving in the wrong direction in a couple of those areas. That, combined with changing federal action, I think is why we've seen things like the DRIVE initiative from Governor Healy, and things that, what can we do collectively as a state to try to respond to some of these new pressures? So that's what the data said, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the panel, but as I mentioned before, we wanted to partner this year also with Massey Polling Group and Steve and his phenomenal team to look at what people in Massachusetts think. And so I want to call Steve up here to go through his slides, and also thanks Steve for traveling here today, I think, from Africa and flying back. Steve's living in Kenya for a year, so really appreciated his partnership on this. And with that, I'll hand it over to Steve Cazella.
Formatting challenges, but we'll continue. I didn't actually travel here from Africa. My family is living here in Kenya, for today. My family is living in Kenya, but I came in last week, so I'm not quite as jet lagged as I would be if I had actually landed today. But what I'm here to talk about is what is the public's view on the topic of competitiveness. What things do they think about? What factors are they interested in? What are they looking at? What do they think about in terms of how Massachusetts is doing compared to other states in kind of on a whole range of topics. So Doug just went through the report on the index itself and the data from that, and then we're going to talk about kind of how the public is reacting to similar topics. So the survey that we're talking about is of the general population of the state of Massachusetts. We have a sample size of 1,000, and it was done kind of back in July. How you should be thinking about this, the meaning of the third bullet point, is that this data is representative of the entire state's population. So we weighted it to be demographically representative on race, age, gender, education, et cetera, as you can see there in the third bullet point. Excuse me. So into the competitiveness ratings. This first item here, what we asked was 2 questions, which you can see there at the bottom. And I think these slides either will be or are posted, so if you have any questions about what the wording was or how a particular demographic group responded, all that information will be posted. But then I'd also just draw your attention to the fact that they're there at the bottom of the slide if you're wondering, like, what was the wording for any of these items that led to these numbers. So the first item here is how people see Massachusetts as a place to live and do business. And the set of darker blue bars there is how people see Massachusetts as a place to live, and then the yellow one is to do business. And you can see that looking out there to the right edge of the chart, you see that well more than half, 63%, say Massachusetts is either one of the best places to live or is at least above average. And just about 60% in total would call it either one of the best or above average as a place to do business. So most people think that it's either better than average or at least average. We had relatively few say that it was out here as either below average or one of the worst. This question then is one that has come up in a lot of ways in the polling that we've done kind of over the last few years, which is, okay, we've just seen that most people think Massachusetts is a cool place, great place to live, good place to do business. But the follow-up question is, for whom? And what difference does it make? How much of a difference does it make if you're looking at people in households with more income versus less income, if you're a person with an advanced degree versus a person with high school or less, where you live in Massachusetts? And what this chart here shows is that it makes quite a bit of difference. So basically what we're looking at here is, again, the blue is one of the best, the yellow is above average, and then we've broken it down here by demographics, starting with income, then education, then region. And you can see that if you're in a household with over $100,000 of income, 73% would say that Massachusetts is at least above average among that sample group. But then when you're down to the under 50,000 households, you can see only 22% would say one of the best, 36% would say above average. So many, many fewer would say that Massachusetts is better than other states if you're in a household with less income. And you can see a similar trend on education, with advanced degree households, much more likely to say that it's above average or one of the best. And then Suffolk County, and actually the closer into Boston you live, you also can see that a similar kind of trend there. We didn't show it because it's a ton of data, but you can then, just in your head, imagine that this would extend to the other items we're about to show, which is it better on education? Is it better on health? Is it better on arts? Is it better on a whole range of things? And across the board, pretty much, you see that this same kind of trend play out. There's a couple on this and other polls where we've seen there's some things that everybody feels like traffic is terrible, no matter how much money you make and that sort of thing. But like on a lot of the items where Massachusetts really does stand out, there is a similar kind of socioeconomic stratification that happens. So then looking down at some of the specific attributes of the state of Massachusetts and what it's like to live here, the question was basically where you think Massachusetts is either better or worse than other states, or where do you think it ranks? And the items where people say better or one of the best, you see healthcare, you see K-12 education, stand out by quite a wide margin. As far as like where way more people say that it's either one of the best or above average, even compared to people who say it's average, and particularly compared to people who would say that it's below average. But then when you look down, further down the chart, you start to see, okay, well, where's Massachusetts not maybe standing out as well? And there you see cost, first of all, you see cost and availability of childcare, overall cost of living, cost and availability of housing are three of kind of those bottom four. And then commute times, of course, being the other one, which I think we can probably all identify with if you made it to this place on this morning. So lots of cost items down there at the bottom where Massachusetts is maybe doing less well. So then we also asked the question, where do you think Massachusetts ranks compared to other states on issues of business competitiveness? This is again asking residents, it's not asking business leaders necessarily. You see kind of other things which you might recognize. You see higher ed, which Doug mentioned. You see educational attainment of the workforce. Of course, you think percent of bachelors, you think the quality of the K-12 system, and so forth and so on. And those two really do stand out, where you've got the two bars for above, basically for above average, sticking out quite a bit further than the percent who would say that we're below average. But it goes further down than that. You see people rating us much less well on, again, cost, energy costs, cost of doing business, healthcare costs, tax burden. So I think the contours of this are probably familiar to us in the business world, but it's particularly interesting to me to see that everyday residents kind of feel the same way about a lot of these topics. Great on education, great on healthcare quality, great. There's other items which you've asked about in other polls, like the arts, quality of the environment, things like that. But then the cost items do fall much further down the list as far as how people think we're doing. So looking then at how people think Massachusetts, what people think our advantage is. This was an open-ended question where you could just say whatever you wanted, and the question was basically, what do you think our competitive advantages are? Where do you think Massachusetts does better than other states? And people could write whatever they want, and then we read through their comments and grouped them into the topics that they mentioned when they could just say, kind of mention any topic that they wanted. So similar theme here, we see education and healthcare way up to the top, and then some other topics which we didn't ask about in the closed-ended questions, but You see again, economy, government, public service, job opportunities, et cetera. So there's kind of a whole range of things that people mention. But again, it's education and healthcare are the top two items where people think that we really do stand out. We asked then the flip side, what do people think that we're not doing well at, or where we have comparative weaknesses? And here again, it's costs, and we also see taxes up there. Those two kind of stick out by quite a bit. And then housing, which by and large is also a cost item. So there's kind of a consistent theme you're seeing develop here, where we do great stuff, we have great stuff, it also costs a lot to live here. So then, zooming out a little bit, looking at how people see the federal picture, the question here was basically, how do you think, well, we'll just read it. Republicans control the White House and both houses of Congress, and the majority of the states in the Supreme Court were appointed by Republican presidents, and then we basically just asked whether this has a positive or negative impact on Massachusetts. And here you can see that you've got just about half saying that they think it will have a negative impact, about twice as many as think that it will have a positive impact on the state of Massachusetts. And then a few kind of in the middle there saying it wouldn't have an impact either way, but that was the picture at the time. I put in the past tense because of course this was July, and a million things happen a day now, so we'd be interested to ask this again, but in July this was how people were kind of viewing this question and this topic. It does vary by party, which I'm sure surprises no one, where you see Democrats much more likely to say negative. These are your negative bars sticking out here in this direction, positive in this direction. And you can see that Democrats, 72% say negative, independents 46%, and then Republicans say 53% positive and 15% negative. So not a huge surprise there. Not a huge surprise there to see that kind of partisan pattern. And of course in Massachusetts, what Democrats think tends to kind of pull things in that direction more, which is why the overall view is kind of closer to that. You do see the same thing on the business environment, which is what that second set of bars down there shows. That one shows how residents think the unified Republican control will impact the Massachusetts business environment rather than just Massachusetts overall. So one question that we've been asking ourselves a lot lately as a state is how many people actually are coming, how many people actually are going, is it more coming or more going, who's coming, all those kinds of things. So we asked people, first of all, just what they think. Is it your sense that more people are moving to Massachusetts or more people are leaving Massachusetts? And we saw that 47% said that they thought more people were leaving rather than coming, and fewer, 31% said that they thought more people were leaving moving to Massachusetts rather than leaving. There's also been a number of polls where the question's been asked in various ways. Are you thinking about, are you planning to, are you going to move out of Massachusetts? And it's been asked in a poll of young people, it's been asked in polls statewide, et cetera, et cetera. And the number in this poll that said yes, they were thinking in the next 5 years, or yes, they see themselves moving out of Massachusetts in the next 5 years, we had 25% say yes. Because it's been asked so many different ways and so many different times, we can kind of go back and look and see where have these numbers been. Is this like a spike, or is this kind of about where it is, where you've got this slice that has always sort of felt uncertain? And as best we could tell, which admittedly was sort of squinting and backing up a ways, it's about where things have been. Like it's in line with like what other polls have shown over the years. So it doesn't seem like there's a big spike of people saying that they're thinking about leaving Massachusetts, but again, with the big caveat that we don't really have like a trend where the same question's been asked over the period of decades or anything like that. We could, though, break it out, again by demographics, break out this question of like who's actually thinking about leaving or who sees themselves moving out of Massachusetts in the next 5 years. And the biggest difference, probably not surprisingly, is age, where you've got 41% of those 18 to 29 saying that they're considering leaving Massachusetts. I mean, certainly one thing to note on that is that we have a lot of people in that age group come to Massachusetts, because you're getting college students, you're getting graduate students, you're getting, all the people that kind of come here for specific reasons and didn't really plan to stay in the first place, or maybe, didn't really have a plan, but that's certainly a caveat on that 18 to 29-year-old group as well. So then the final thing that we asked people basically was a series of questions about what we could potentially do about it, whether it would work. So this question was issues that the state government could work on, and what were the top 3 where people thought Massachusetts was lagging behind compared to other states. And similar theme here, cost of living, housing costs, and taxes being the top 3, with transportation and commute times being right there. And then if you kind of scan down, you can see the things that people think that we're kind of good at already. You didn't really have as many people thinking that the state government should focus on those issues. It tended again to be costs, with commute time perhaps like a second-tier issue. The question though is, okay, well, if you do those things, will it actually make a difference? And that's what this chart here shows. So if the government were to focus on improving these issues, how much of a difference would it make? And the items were the ones we put in this question, the items that we kind of thought would be the ones where people were the most discontented, costs, housing costs, taxes, and so forth, which turned out to be the ones that people were the most discontented about. But the interesting thing about this chart is that people actually do think that it could make a pretty big difference. So about 3/4 in each of these top, so 70 to 77% said that it could make a big difference if state government were to focus on taxes, focus on housing costs, or focus on cost of living. So people aren't quite ready to just throw up their hands and say, you know what, screw this, I'm out of here. Like, there still is some optimism about the possibility that state government can actually fix some of these things. So that's a super quick tour through the data. Again, it's posted somewhere, and we'll tell you where. And then you can dig and spelunk all you want through the data. So thank you.
Okay, come on up. Don't be shy. Okay, good. Okay, great presentations. Thank you, Doug and Steve, for that information, and thank you to our panelists. You've met Doug and Sarah, but let me introduce President of the University of Massachusetts System, Marty Meehan. Marty, a good friend, a great leader of the UMass system, former congressman, did great things at the UMass Lowell before ascending to the overall leadership of the organization. And Marty is a voice in the higher education community that steps outside of his responsibilities for UMass to advocate on behalf of higher education in the Commonwealth quite effectively. So thank you for joining us here today.
Thank you.
I also want to, Sarah, acknowledge working with the Chamber and the Mass Taxpayers Foundation. I saw my friend J.D. Tesloff earlier today. J.D., where have you been? Over there, another co-conspirator on the work of competitiveness with the business community who's joined us here today. I thought I'd begin by sharing a couple of my own thoughts on this issue of competitiveness. I'm both an optimist and an intensely competitive person. So I enjoy conversations like this, and I think one of the success factors of Massachusetts is our willingness to confront challenges. I think that goes back to probably some of our culture and our ethic that, we look at ourselves in the mirror when we criticize ourselves, and then we go to work on improving that. And I think that's a healthy thing. I think conversations like this are good. In my role, I have the benefit of traveling and talking to chamber leaders and others all over the country. I didn't fly in from Africa, but I flew in from Austin, Texas last night after a few days with chamber presidents from all over the country and listened to what's going on in their cities. They envy us. They want to know what's going on in Boston. They think about some of those positive things that these reports talked about. And I can tell you that, I walked around Austin, I talked to their chamber president about his challenges, and, I'm glad to be home. Despite the fact that it was 85 degrees today, the past few days, that wasn't too hard to take. So So optimistic about Massachusetts and driven by our willingness to confront challenges. Before I get to the questions, one quick Chamber of Commerce note that Doug talked about the eds and meds, the higher education and medical community, and this report does a lot of good work in pointing out some of the issues there, but I would point you to a statewide economic impact report that the Chamber just published. It's on our website. It talks about why this is important. Why is it important to talk about those industries? And I think the report that we published underscores that it is critically important because, as you'll see if you take a look at it, 1 in 5 people in Massachusetts work in those industries. And there's a lot of other data on tax revenue and other forms of economic impact if you get a chance. So I want to begin. We heard 2 good presentations on data and analytics, and the other on opinions about competitiveness. So why don't we start with Sarah and Marty and just ask you, what's your reaction to what you heard from these reports? Surprised, not surprised? What are the points that were made that stuck out for you?
I don't think, not really surprising. We've seen migration, young people, particularly people between the ages of 20 and 35 leaving. That's an issue that we have to deal with. From a UMass perspective, one of the great things that we bring the economy of Massachusetts is most of our students, in fact 70%, stay in Massachusetts. I worry if there aren't private sector jobs being created at high enough level. Housing has been a major issue. Energy costs, that's not a surprise. We have to find a way to try to deal with that. But I do step back and look at our healthcare system, and I look at our world-class teaching hospitals, research hospitals. We're really the envy of the world. I mean, people come from all over the world to come to our hospitals that we have here in Massachusetts and here in Boston. So it is still the best place from my vantage point to live in the world. And I think we have the brain power to solve the challenges that we have. And I think the study is awesome for all of us to take a look at, to digest, and then figure out what are we going to do to try to meet these challenges. And I think that's exactly what all of us intend to do.
Well said. I agree with all of that, and as the parent, I know, Marty, you are young folks. I think getting us focused on what it will take to keep them here, beyond being subsidized by their parents, which I know we can both relate to. Exactly, we can both relate to. I think these findings are incredibly helpful to get us focused so that we're sure we're having the right conversations. But I share both of your senses of optimism, and this just reinforces, and just noting the kind of friction between healthcare costs, the cost of healthcare being high on the anxiety list about challenges that we face in the state, but the confidence in our healthcare system being off the charts, that there's nowhere else you would want to be. If you found yourself in a situation with a health condition that required treatment, you want to be in Massachusetts. There's broad knowledge of the breakthroughs, the science that's developed here. One of the other things that really struck me in digesting this is we live in a time where our confidence as a country in legacy institutions has fallen, and our confidence overall in government's ability to solve societal problems is something that we've seen erode over time. This has been decades in the making. And it just really struck me that when you ask people here about their belief in local government's ability to respond to what they also articulated as challenges is extraordinarily high. And so to me, that contributes to my feeling of optimism of, okay, that means we've kind of earned the right to play. We have clear identification of our challenges. And so again, I think what you're all saying is then we can respond to these concerns by working together. I think we've got better preconditions to be able to continue to make meaningful progress.
Yeah, when you look at surveys that measure confidence, Edelman and Weber-Shandwick, very low scores for government. But interestingly enough, and this speaks to the role of the business community, very high expectations and confidence that the business community can rally to solve these things. People feel like their employers can play a role in dealing with these issues, which is both, it's nice to hear the confidence in the business community, but it comes with an expectation that people are actually going to act on it. Doug, the survey, how many indicators are there in this survey? And by the way, let me double down and get the question in.
Yeah.
How many are there? And if you had to narrow it down to the three most important ones, what would they be?
Yeah, so there's, of course, there have to be 27. You can't have any more or less than 27.
Hey, Doug?
Yeah.
Thank you, Heather.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Thank you, sorry. So
There are 27 metrics, and that is the perfect number. But if I had to reduce it lower than 27, to me, K-12 education would consider to be one of them, right? And that is a barometer that thankfully has been such a strong barometer in recent years. But I do really worry about, one, the data that we're already seeing about test scores in Massachusetts, that they remain higher than other states, but they're lower than they were prior to the pandemic, right? And that's a concern, and other states that get that right faster than we do, or make that up faster than we do, that's the seed corn of the Massachusetts future economy, right? You see, that's why people want to live here. It's quality of healthcare, things like that. But it's the perception of that you are going to come here, or you're going to live here and give your children the best opportunity in their schools. That's one. To me, it's really that the overall cost of living item as well, because there's so much wrapped into that. And one of the things I find fascinating, right, is you do see a bit of a disconnect between where did we see the biggest change, $1,000 per employee in terms of an increase in healthcare costs. And yet the perception among folks is costs are a big concern, but we didn't see healthcare at that same level of kind of the public perception. And so I do think, whereas housing has been such a critical kind of public issue, and it's a real issue, but sometimes I think that kind of messaging of where your cost concern is can differentiate a little bit from where we see some of the data. That's not to say housing costs aren't a huge issue, but I think the overall cost burden, sometimes folks want to get very tactical about we got to solve this one and then we'll unlock the cost key. It is energy, it's healthcare, it's housing, and it's overall kind of tax burden and those types of things. So those would be kind of the key. And then the other one I would talk about really gets to NIH funding, VC, because that's what speaks to this. Okay, so we're going to have good schools, we're going to have smart people who live here. How well are we connecting that to our overall economy, and how is that changing? Because as long as we can keep that going, as long as the next new thing for the economy is going to want to start here or out in Silicon Valley, because this is where you're going to have the talent, I think we've got a lot going for us. Once you see that disconnect and you see that concern with the private employment job numbers, that's where you get to concern that there's a break has occurred between what is supposed to be this virtuous cycle between smart people move here, raise their kids here, and they move on to the next big thing in the economy.
Amadi, do you have one or two of these indicators that you say, this is what makes an economy healthy? This is what makes an economy healthy?
Well, I mean, I worry about the private sector job growth. I also worry about the number of new companies that are being created. We're a research hub here, and there are so many companies that spin off from research, from MIT research, UMass research, Harvard research, and we need to keep this research infrastructure going to have the opportunity to create more companies here. It is more expensive here to do business sometimes, but we create those companies that employ people, and that worries me. I think looking at this, that's the thing that probably worries me the most.
And I would just add half the cost of housing. So I think that's a key part of when you're trying to attract people here. That's the thing people face first when they come here. They've got to put a deposit down on renting an apartment. And so it's kind of the first thing that they confront when they're contemplating if I've got a choice between what city do I want to come work in. It's one of the first things you experience in terms of cost. You just have to hold it close.
Hello, okay. Yeah, it's a bit of an unfair question to ask you to pick one, but I'm a jobs guy. I think a lot falls out of sort of job creation in an economy, both in terms of the things we measure economically, but also just in one's self-worth and one's self-confidence, to be able to feel good about themselves and feel positive about the place that they work in. Doug, I'm going to come back to you again on the index. This is the second annual. Some of the indicators are a little like watching grass grow. They're not going to move much from year to year. Assuming you're going to continue this, how do you make it relevant? How do you continue to tell the story that, and make people pay attention? Because these are important reports that remind people of what's going on.
Yeah, great question. That's something that we talk quite a bit about, and I'd answer that in a few ways. One is, so what we wanted to do this year, and I think, assuming Steve and his team agreed to it, is to connect the data with the perception, right? Because you do see some interesting disconnects there. And the other thing that really jumps out to me is, as you mentioned, Jim, when you look at some of these things, they're probably not going to move from 1st to 50th or 50th to 1st in 1 year. But what really jumped out to me was public perception of how much action can make a difference on cost and on housing. And that is a real opportunity. I think, to Jim's point, it's also a real kind of threat if you're on Beacon Hill or if you're other places, because that also means if you don't make a difference, right? If things aren't changing, people are going to blame you, right? They're going to assume that your action can make a difference. And so I think connecting what we're doing with the perception of what's happening, I think, is critical. The other thing that Andy Bagley and our team, working with Pablo Suarez and Victoria Bergeron, have done a phenomenal job with is, okay, so we're going to keep kind of these baseline metrics and track them, but then every year we're going to pick something to really take a deep dive in and pick some new metrics and look at it a little differently. And this year, it was about higher education. It was about research. I don't think we're necessarily going to drop those things next year because I don't think those things are going away, but it was really trying to take a look at what other data sources are out there that speak to what's in front of folks right now. And from our perspective, I think getting back to this idea that we can get a little complacent sometimes on our strengths. And you think of that postdoc number, right? So we are second in the country nominally in terms of the number of postdocs employed in Massachusetts, right? And think of this, these are super smart people who are doing research, by definition, doing research and stuff that is going to lead them to what's next in their career and is so kind of aligned with where the Massachusetts economy is. And so you think of the exposure Massachusetts has and why that could be a place where we all need to be on the same page. So many of these policy issues, people are going to be in different places and going to have different opinions. But if we don't protect Massachusetts' relative strength in attracting those folks who live in Massachusetts and from around the country and around the world, that this is the place they want to be, as opposed to Austin, that is something that should be a threat for all of us. And so I think we'll delve into that a little more. And then one thing I would just say for folks who are here, and we say this to our members, a couple of the ones that we added this year related to climate risk and stuff like that come from conversations with folks like you. So as you look at the index and you say, hey, it's great, but why aren't you looking at this? Why aren't you checking on this? I'm curious about this. Those are the kind of things we want to add as well. Because maybe we could get to 28 metrics.
I was going to say, you want to go for 27?
We did drop a couple this year. So.
Okay, Sal, I'm going to come back to you, and whenever someone starts a question with, not to put you on the spot.
Those are my favorite.
You should start worrying. So one of the biggest negative movers in the index was Massachusetts falling from 35th to 48th for employer health care premium costs, with employer premiums going up more than $1,000 between 2022 and 2023. So you live in the world every day. What's happening? What's your take on this growth? And this is a competitiveness index. What do you see differently in other states?
Well, I think we're all feeling it. So everyone on this panel, you run organizations, you run companies, and the premium increases that you've gotten from whoever, I hope it's Blue Cross Blue Shield, but if it isn't, but from whoever insures you, you're all feeling it. And I would venture to guess that all of you sitting in the audience right now are feeling it. We at Blue Cross, this is our business, just passed on a 20% increase in the cost of health insurance coverage to our own workforce, because it turns out our medical trend for our workforce is running hotter than just the average trend of our whole book of business. This is hard. We still pay 87% of the cost of coverage, which is more generous than what most other employers are able to do. But we're all having to make hard calls about our bottom line, given the pressures that we've seen show up in this competitiveness index in terms of the pressures that we're all feeling running our companies, running our organizations and our educational institutions. So why? So first, I would say at the end of your question was, is this happening other places? And the answer is yes. This is happening all across the country. Healthcare costs are up dramatically, no matter where you sit. And I spend a lot of time with the CEOs of Blue Plans. In fact, I'm going to Chicago to a meeting with all the Blue Plan CEOs tonight. And we're all seeing this to varying degrees, but everyone is running a double-digit increase in the cost of health insurance. I've been doing this, I'm 54, for 30 plus years. I have never seen a trend this high before in my career. The last time it got close was in 2007 and 2008, but even that wasn't this high. So why? Well, it's a lot of things, and some of it, epidemiologists are going to be able to tell us more in probably 15 or 20 years. It's a little hard to answer how much of this is care and delayed diagnoses that resulted from the pandemic, when people were either pushing things off or not able to get in. We know, and this is global, that cancer diagnoses are up. They're up more disproportionately in the United States than they are in other parts of the world. So that's the bad news. The good news is we're getting better at treating cancer. Cancer is becoming a lot less like a death sentence and a lot more like a chronic disease, depending on the kind of cancer you have. Well, treating chronic diseases is really expensive. And so it used to be, I'll just keep going down the path of cancer, that you would get treated, maybe radiation, maybe chemo. You'd have a course of chemo, it would end, and hopefully you'd be in remission. Well, that's not how cancer is treated anymore. You are often on a series of drugs, stacked drugs. Sometimes you're on maintenance drugs to keep your cancer under control for the rest of your life. So that's fantastic news relative to caring for those we love, but it has implications for the cost of healthcare. And I could go down the list. Behavioral health, we knew that behavioral health use increased a lot during the pandemic. We had a lot of really worried and depressed folks, and we started talking about it. So we've made incredible progress as a community, destigmatizing behavioral health. And so people, as a result, and this is good news, are getting more of it. But behavioral health, both on an outpatient and an inpatient basis, and these are national data, is up about 50% in the last couple of years. And so that's, again, one of those that's great, because people are getting access to care that they need. And these are all the things that are behind the scenes contributing to the growth in what you're seeing and experiencing in your premium dollars. And so what we do about it is going to require hard choices. And I know I'm going to quit talking in a second, but we've got some thoughts. Some of this is the thing that we can control is the price for healthcare, the price that we pay for healthcare services. And so we're having harder conversations between us as health plans and the providers, the fantastic hospitals and physician organizations and pharmaceutical companies that drive all of them collectively these medical breakthroughs, often, as we mentioned, happen in Massachusetts. We're having harder conversations about the prices we can afford to pay for those services. And they result in, some of you may have noticed, that we had a pretty tough contract negotiation with a really big system in this state. I don't think that's going to be the last. I think you're going to see more and more of that kind of friction in the system. And we're starting to have deeper conversations about health planning, so that we're taking a long-term view in this state about how is the population of this state expected to change over the next 10 to 20 years, and what does that mean about how many hospital beds we need? How is technology evolving? Maybe we don't need as many hospital beds. Do we have them in the right places? Do we have enough? We have a primary care shortage. Do we have enough geriatricians as we anticipate more of an aging population? We have not, nationally and certainly not in Massachusetts, invested in the resources in those kinds of health planning conversations for decades. We saw that in COVID. We had starved our investment in public health. And so we have other ideas, but those are just a few concrete examples of the kinds of things that we are beginning to do as a community. They're going to be hard. We don't know if it's going to be popular. And the reality is there's going to be less federal money in the system.
Well, thank you for that thoughtful and in-depth answer, because as we saw in the analysis and we saw in the poll, healthcare costs was a very big item in the reports this year. And Marty and I, as the two baby boomers on the panel, very thankful for the thoughtfulness going into demographic planning, but I'm sure that's a factor.
It seems that the older you get, the more you want to have the top healthcare system.
That's it. Marty, you mentioned earlier, attracting business and so forth, Sarah, and I've had the same experience, noted that this is a concern all over the country, healthcare costs. So in some ways, that levels the playing field a little bit. But Sarah also noted that in some ways, this gets passed on to employers, gets passed on to people. Talk about it from an employer perspective in terms of this phenomenon of healthcare
the challenges we face at UMass are enormous, and healthcare is a big part of it. I do want to comment on something Sarah said, which is nobody wants to close a hospital. They just had a budget process up at the State House, and there's an amendment that passed that said that UMass would take over Norwood Hospital. You know how much money Norwood Hospital is losing? Why would UMass be able to take it over? And so nobody wants to close a hospital. Nobody wants a university to close. And it's just sort of those expectations, I think, that aren't realistic. So I think one of the things we have to do is get realistic about things. But yeah, look, it affects all of our costs. Universities, people, businesses, and most of our costs at UMass have to do with faculty and staff, and they all get health care. And with health care going up 10%, 8%, 12%, it puts more and more pressure on how we're going to offer a world-class education, at the same time make it affordable, which is the number one challenge that we face at UMass. We've made a lot of progress on it, but it's the biggest challenge we have. Our sticker price isn't too high. What we need to do is make sure we get enough financial aid to people so it's accessible to everyone.
Doug, you just participated in a health policy conversation. Sarah mentioned some ways to deal with this. What ideas came out of that conversation?
I think one of the things that was most notable is how tough a knot this is going to be to untangle, because as Sarah mentioned at the end of her remarks, this was going to be a challenge, full stop, right? And at the same time, we know that based on our analysis, we're going to lose out on about $26 billion in federal funding for healthcare over the next 10 years, right? So that's $26 billion that's going to leave the system, that's going to save us no money, right? That's just resources departing the system. And at the same time, we're going to see 250, 300,000 people potentially lose access to existing subsidized care for which the feds are footing a large part of the bill, right? So the first thing, and that's a huge challenge. My hope is that that can be a jumping off point for us to build on some of these trust issues to figure out how to kind of move forward. And what I mean by that is it should be in everyone's best interest to keep as many of those 250,000 people who are potentially losing out on mass health or connector care enrolled in state subsidized programs as possible, because that keeps the federal dollars in Massachusetts. And so one place we can go where I think everyone has to have skin in the game is how do we make sure we keep that number close to 150,000 people or 100,000 people, because that is in everyone's best financial interest. And my hope is the second thing we need to be able to do is mass health cost growth in the FY26 budget grew by 10% over the prior year, right? That's bad for a bunch of reasons, right? And exactly as Sarah said, it's acuity, right? It's the fact that with the long-term care services, all those things are growing. We need to be clear with our expectations and say, you know what, in the fiscal year 2027 budget, we need to empower the state's Medicaid program to try to live within, I'm not saying 3%, let's try 6% this year, right? Like, let's try something that at least gets us down there, and to see what tools would they have to use to try to get those numbers down. And those tools are going to be challenging for everyone, right? It's going to be paying less for healthcare in some cases. It's going to mean making sure we're prioritizing the services we do provide. But the reality is the resources that are available, we know are going to be reduced because of federal policy changes. Some of that maybe we can make up with the state coming in with different ways, but that just means it's either going to be employers who pay, providers who pay, or the state who pays, and no one's got free money hanging around, right? And so I think that looking at those two challenges are the places that I would start.
So both this report and the Chambers Eds and Meds report focused on how unique and valuable the intersection of education, research, innovation is to the state's economy. Marty, you've been, as I said, a leader at UMass and a leader in speaking out about these issues on behalf of the whole entire higher education community. So how about these federal actions directed in NIH grants and higher education, autonomy, immigration? How do they affect our competitive advantages that we have today? And how is UMass and the higher education community thinking about these?
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a dinner tonight with the presidents of Harvard, MIT, Northeastern, BC, BU, Tufts. It's actually over at Sunil's.
Why not Holy Cross?
Well,
Group therapy.
Holy Cross doesn't do quite as much research. So the research, and we've been working together, developing strategy. I will say this: The governor's drive proposal is really smart and innovative. She put a lot of work, we've been meeting, she's been meeting with us, the UMass folks, but also the private institutions. It's a $400 million investment that could serve as a bridge. It's one of the most innovative things that any governor has done in the country. That's a start. Our medical school gets more NIH funding than 19 states. This is a big deal. And the other thing I want to say is, I served in Congress for 14 years. This wasn't a Democrat-Republican issue. I was a ranking Democrat on the Armed Services Research and Development Committee. We authorized $2 billion a year in research money. Republicans wanted research just as much as Democrats do. So I think it's not clear what the strategy is coming out of Washington. I don't think they know what the strategy is. We have to work as hard as we can with red state university presidents, public and private, and we have to keep working that. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. The study that you guys did, the chamber did on eds and meds, we did one, the governor asked us to do one at the Donahue Institute at UMass that shows 80,000 jobs in Massachusetts tied into federal research dollars. So we have to do a better job of educating people on it. But just as an example, NIH funding, we built a $350 million research building at the medical school because NIH had said, we will help pay for that building. You're doing $250 million. Now they're threatening to take it away. Well, what do we do with paying the cost of that? So we're working together, the public and the private. I thought it was great that the governor put the private institutions in with the public institutions. And hopefully the legislature will pass that and we'll try to find a bridge that can get us through this. Because one other point I want to make, we have 2 Nobel laureates at the medical school. If we lose our researchers to Germany, to Canada, they're not going to come back. We're an $870 million research engine at UMass, and we're third in Massachusetts. Harvard and MIT are just above it. If we lose this, it's going to take years to build it back, and that's the real challenge here. A couple of really bad years, and we're going to be in trouble trying to build back what it's taken decades for us to build.
Okay, we're almost at time. I want to end on what many consider to be Massachusetts' competitive advantage, which is our talented workforce. And talk a little bit about, there's basically limited population growth. I don't know if it's quite zero. Limited job growth, these cost factors. I want to get on the line here and just close with your thoughts on keeping and attracting people to Massachusetts.
Well, I think it's as you indicated, it's all about the jobs. And I think given the strength of the educational institutions in the state and the private sector companies, I think, part of the answer is recruiting here, deeper partnerships that create, and I think we've got some great examples of this, co-ops and internships, so that we're creating a pipeline to meaningful jobs that keep people in the state. So I think there's more that we can do.
Bob Reynolds, the former CEO of Putnam, I think it was a Boston Chamber event. He got up, and he's a big, active Republican. And I want to make it clear this shouldn't be a partisan issue. He said every college graduate in Massachusetts should be able to get an H-1B visa application, and we should keep them here because we need the talent. One of the problems is this immigration mentality that has no relation to how the economy works. I was in Florida recently. I'm thinking to myself, if you take out every undocumented person in this state, there will be no economy in this state, all the people who travel. So one of the things we need to do is have an intelligent conversation about immigration. And I got to tell you, George W. Bush, when he was president, had a great immigration reform bill. John McCain and Ted Kennedy, Republican, Democrat, had a great immigration reform. We can't keep our economy strong if we're going to start saying we're going to throw everyone out that's undocumented and we're not going to let anybody else in. All of the major private and public research universities are having difficulty attracting postdoc students, master's degree programs. It's bad for the country, but it's bad for Massachusetts.
And I would just say quickly, I think that the challenges we're talking about is exactly as Sarah said, Marty said, they're not unique to us, right? Everyone's facing these headwinds. And so if we can solve some of these issues a little more innovatively than other states are doing, and I think of the DRIVE initiative, I think of the fact that all K-12 public school systems are struggling post-pandemic, if we can unlock kind of the way to do that stuff better, I think it becomes a comparative advantage for Massachusetts. And I think you see some positive data, right? In 2024, due to international immigration, Massachusetts labor force exceeded 2019 levels for the first time in 7 years, right? You see the key to how you get people to want to be here, and if we can attack some of these challenges in a way that's better than the other states are doing and use our competitive advantage in terms of innovation towards those policy challenges, I think it's an opportunity.
Well, thank you all for being here. Doug, congratulations on another great report. Mass Taxpayers Foundation continues to do great research and put reports out there that are not biased, just putting the facts, the data out there, and allowing us to have conversations about what that data says and what we can do about it. Please join me in thanking Sarah.